though there weren't actually new card reveals for the usual Tuesday reveal stream, that doesn't mean we haven't have anything to talk about, because we still have a couple of new strides to tackle, including the 2 new strides that were revealed today. So let's talk about some Genesis, Pale Moon, and Nubatama. Stand up! Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we have once again another premium collection video. And yes, I already uploaded another one earlier today, which was initially planned for yesterday, but because of certain things I had to delay the release of that video, hence why the timing of things that I said didn't really make sense in the context of the actual day. But that's besides the point. Time travel and wibbly wobbly time spacey things sometimes get a little bit weird. But that's not the topic of today's video, because today we have 3 different strides and 3 different G-guards to tackle, and some of them are quite interesting. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into these new cards, and we're gonna start off with the one for Genesis, which again had me scratching my head, because when I saw the artwork, I could have sworn this would have been a Kagero stride, because for Genesis, we've got the following stride: Offering Souls, Heavenly Dragon, Jakdakna Lurga. And Jakdakna Lurga has the following effects: Auto Vanguard Circle, once a turn, when this unit attacks, cost, turn a card from your G-zone face up. Pretty simple cost. Choose any number of cards with different grades from your drop, put them into your soul, and this unit gets power plus 10k until the end of turn. Which is basically a soul charge 4, because you have 0, 1, 2, and 3, or a soul charge 5 if you also play Valkyrian, because we're talking about Genesis here. So you could have like soul charge 4, maybe 5, but that's really stretching it here. And then this unit gets power plus 10 until the end of turn. So essentially, you just power up your Vanguard, you fill your soul up with cards, maybe specific cards that interact being in the soul or put into the soul or whatnot. Maybe that has some synergy, because we're talking about Genesis here. And that can be a nice setup for whatever other strategy you're trying to employ, because you can then soul blast those cards for other costs, including its secondary effect, which is Auto Vanguard Circle. When your opponent's unit is put into the Guardian Circle, other than from deck, cost soul blast 3. Retire that unit, your opponent looks at the top card of the deck and calls it to the Guardian Circle. So this is a different type of guard break that we see in other clans. Now, for anybody that's wondering how this interacts with G-guards and Perfect Guards and any other card that has a Guardian Circle skill, the way how this interacts is that those effects that your opponent puts on the Guardian Circle will go on standby at the same time that this skill will go on standby. But you, as the turn player, have priority, so you will resolve your skill first before your opponent. So you first are going to retire the unit, and then your opponent is forced to call a new card from the top of their deck. But that doesn't mean they cannot use their skills, because with Vanguard, you don't necessarily have to have the same unit still lingering on the field to activate the skills that already went on standby. So in the case of a Perfect Guard, you can still resolve the Perfect Guard skill even though the Perfect Guard unit has been removed from the Guardian Circle. So you can still get the Sentinel effect, so your attack is nullified. And the same goes with G-Guardians and any other special effect. Unless the skill requires you to have the specific card still on the field while you're resolving the skill, it shouldn't really matter all too much. But in terms of what this card actually does and how it interacts, honestly, this card isn't the greatest type of stride for Genesis, because Genesis already have other options that are probably a lot better. But I think this is a nice one-off in almost every G-zone for Genesis, because this card might be a win condition in situations that were unwinnable. A good example is that if your opponent has like a gigantic hand that you know you cannot break through, you can still stride into this thing and still potentially win that turn if you're up against decks like Grand Blue, maybe your Mirror Match, Dark Regulars, or something that goes fast through their deck, because this card can potentially force your opponent into a deck out situation. Because yes, they are still forced to guard your attacks, because otherwise they're gonna die, especially if they're at 5. And if you can attack more than enough times to diminish and basically exhaust the last cards in their deck while they're guarding, you can essentially just close the game right then and there. You need a certain amount of soul to get through this condition, especially if they have quite a significant amount of cards left in their deck, but this can be a nice way to halter that. But at the same time, this could also work well into preventing your opponent to have the ideal next turn, because yes, you might not deck them out with this stride, but if you can lower the deck size more than enough, you can potentially shut down certain turns where maybe if you're up against Grand Blue and they wanted to go into their Restender, if they want to go into that card, they need to at least have 5 cards left in deck. 6 cards if you include the draw for turn. So if you can lower the amount of cards to below that threshold, you can basically eliminate that option from their playstyle. And this can go for many other decks, and it all comes down to knowing your matchup and knowing going into this stride can help you to secure that potential situation or not. So even though this isn't the most flashiest of stride, I think it has some neat interactions and usage where it allows you to secure games or close games in other situations where you otherwise wouldn't have stood a chance regardless of what you did. So interesting card. Might see play, but very, very minimal. Now, if we take a look at the G-guard, as we got heavily support Bright Dragon Arnavarta. And Arnavarta has the effect, although when units put in the Guardian Circle, cost, put a card from your hand or Rearguard Circle into your soul, and this unit gets shield plus 10k until the end of battle. So, just by putting one card, so this could be a -1 essentially, you have 25k shield. It's not the greatest, but it could give you the soul that you can then use for other skills, so it sets up for your future plays. Then the second part of the skill is, then cost, put a total of 2 cards from your hand or Rearguard Circle into your soul, choose one of your opponent's units, and this unit gets critical -2 until the end of turn. So this is quite interesting, because now you can essentially block 2 attacks at the same time, because you can use G-guard on one attack, stop the attack, and then -2 critical on another attack that now is swinging for 0 critical or -1. And if that's a Restender, this G-guard can essentially block for a lot of attacks. The only issue that I have with this G-guard is that it's quite a lot of investment, because you first need to put a card into the soul, either Rearguard or a card from hand. Then you need to put another 2 cards from the Rearguard Circle or from your hand into the soul. And don't forget, you also need to discard for the Hue Guardian, so it's similar like the Gear Chronicle one, where you're going to invest 4 cards in order to get the full resolution. Now, unlike the Gear Chronicle G-guard, I think the payout here is much greater, because it can potentially guard for multiple attacks. At least 2, the one you're guarding, and then the one you're going to give minus criticals. But if that minus criticals on a restanding unit that can potentially swing multiple times, that will then significantly increase the value of this G-guard. So I think it has some place, but I think it's very specific in usage because of the heavy investment into this card. But at the same time, keep in mind, it goes towards the soul, which then can fuel your next turn if you're going to rely on a lot of soul blasting or you need a certain amount of cards in your soul. So I can definitely see this card being used and come up in a lot of situations, but we have to figure out how often you can go into this without being punished for the amount of investments you have to do for this G-guard. Now, talking about things that goes towards the soul, that brings us to Pillmoon. And Pillmoon's new support, oh boy, it's pretty good. It's pretty damn spicy, as we've got a brand new stride in the likes of Transient Megatrick Leontina. And Leontina has the following effect. Auto Vanguard Circle, very important, it has no Magia, so it doesn't synergize with the Princess Stride. When this unit attacks, cost, counter +1, and discard a card from your hand. And put all of your rear guards into the soul, choose up to 2 unit cards from your soul for each card put, and call them to the rearguard circle. If you called 4 more cards with different grades until the end of turn, when your opponent would call cards from their hand to the guardian circle, they must call 2 or more at the same time. So this card does 2 separate things. First off, it allows you essentially to reload your board. You attack with all the units on the board, then you use the skill, suck everything in, and essentially call everything out and potentially more. Because if you call 2 units to the field, you can suck them both in and call 4 units out after that. Which is kind of nuts. This is an insane multi-tech enabler, and it can also make any weird-ass hand turn into the perfect field, because if you already soul charge the pieces you need, but you don't have the correct pieces in your hand to start your combos, just call 1 or 2 cards down, and this stride will fix the rest for you, which is pretty good for 1 counterblast and 1 discard, if I'm gonna be honest, because you're gonna plus like crazy, especially with all the multi-tech this enables. But on top of that, if you meet the requirement of calling multiple grades, adding the extra Battle Door and Guard Restrict on top of this can make any turn become lethal, especially if you're putting your opponent at 4 or 5 damage early on, or maybe even with the first initial wave of this attack, because if you see they don't hit a defensive and are already at 4 or 5, then going forward, also calling a grade 0, which can be aka your starter, can allow you to close the game right then and there. And believe me, I've seen situations, especially with the Nightmare Doll deck, where I can potentially kill on first strike, but because they can one card block most of my attacks, they can barely survive the first strike turn, which is sometimes a bit annoying, especially if they have very explosive strides on the crackback. With this card, those are things from the past. Yes, you sacrifice a couple things, like you cannot synergize with Darkseid's Princess, so you don't get the second Vanguard swing and the extra rearguard attack, and this card also doesn't G-flip, so it's less likely that you can go into a dust after this, but why care if go into dust if this card can potentially win you in the game? But keep in mind, this doesn't have to be your first strike, this can also be your finisher. And while we're on the topic of Nightmare Dolls, this card can basically sets up your Nightmare Doll loop right then and there, because you can just call any 2 cards, and then if you had the perfect write-up, or at least to some extent a good write-up, where you can have Ginny and Leslie into your soul, and you have an Alice that you might call from hand or somewhere else, then you can essentially just call all the cards out, because you can have the Ginny grade 1, Ginny grade 2, the Leslie grade 1, and the Alice grade 3. Then the Ginny goes back and calls another Alice or whatever, and you call the starter, or maybe the crit sentinels, or the crit triggers, because keep in mind you can call out the crit triggers that you just popped in for the draw and plus 10k power. You can pop them back out, and then basically do the loop from there. And because you just called all the significant numbers for the grades, you just got the Battle Door effect. And that Genie, that's 12. Yes, that would have been 5k block, 5k block, 5k block. That's no longer 5k block, 5k block, 5k block, because you need to waste 2 cards every single time. So for every extra counterblast you face up, that's 2 extra cards from your opponent's hand, including the Alice that also will swing. So that's actually 4 cards per counterblast on the attacks, and the first initial wave of attacks won't cost you counterblast. So yeah, this could be devastating. And also, that's just only talking about Nightmare Dolls. This could go for every single Pale Moon archetype and strategy, because this thing is beautifully generic. But while we're on the topic of beautifully generic cards for Pale Moon, we also have the new G-guard, and yeah, this is a G-guard that might be in the running for the strongest G-guard of this set. Because for their G-guard, they got Jester, Demonic Beast, Flexion, Chimera. And Flexion Chimera is flexing on its opponents because its effect is auto. When this unit is put onto the Guardian Circle, put 1 or more cards from your hand into your soul, which is essentially set up for your next turns, because soul is a resource here. And this unit gets shield plus 10k until the end of the battle for each card put into your soul for this cost. Already that alone makes this card ridiculously good, or at least relatively good, because every single card becomes a 10k block. And that means all the G-era grade 2s and grade 1s essentially have the same shield value as the V-era grade 1s, which is actually quite a lot. The only thing that you don't want to do with this effect is put triggers in, but why would you otherwise? So essentially this card makes your hand have more shield for free, while also setting up your next turn, because you're just putting grade 3s and grade 2s and grade 1s into the soul, which is perfect. But that's just one part. Now we get to the fun part of this card, because if 2 or more cards were put into your soul for this cost, your opponent chooses one of their stand rearguards and put it into their soul. So this is basically a Denial Griffin Hater round for Pale Moon. And honestly, this might be better than Hate Around, because it just shut it off like Denial Griffin. And honestly, this might be better than Denial Griffin, because this G-guard can also block the attack that it isn't putting into the soul. So your opponent can attack with their Vanguard, you slam this thing down, put a couple of cards into soul, you block the Vanguard attack, and then you say, oh, that annoying rearguard with guard restrict, reset capabilities, extra criticals, or whatever, maybe drive checks on the rearguard circle. But put the thing into the soul. You can have 1 soul, but you cannot have those attacks or the extra value that card generates. It's perfect. Like, it's insanely strong and it's absolutely generic. And the fact that this doesn't cost resources. Keep in mind, this card doesn't cost you resources. No Counter Blast, no Soul Blast. In fact, it generates resources. It's ridiculous. I think this is probably the best G-guard in this set, and arguably the best G-guard in the game. But that's just me being very excited about this card, and also very happy that we're gonna get more of these interesting playability cards that also, at the very least, make these very annoying Super Battledore stride units like Morfessa, the new Bartholomew stride for Grand Blue, potentially a bit more bearable. And also, it stops annoying loop decks. But at the same time, as a Gear Chronicle player that really relies on his rearguards to stay on the board during my opponent's turn, it also kind of annoys me. But that said, we also have to talk about another clan, because we also have new Nubatama cards. And first off, we have the new stride for Nubatama, which is Rikudo Stealth Rogue Yotsuka Lord. And Yotsuka Lord has the effect: act on Vanguard Circle once a turn, cost Counter +1 and Soul +1. You choose 3 units cards from your opponent's drop. Your opponent chooses any number of cards from among them and calls them to the rearguard circle. Your opponent card's auto abilities do not activate from this call. Your opponent chooses a card from their hand for each called unit and discards it. For each card that was not called from the cards you chose, you draw a card, and all of your front units get power +10 until the end of turn. Okay, right before we start analyzing this card, I want to immediately tell you guys that no, this card doesn't work the way that some of you might think. Usually in Vanguard, you always say you resolve the skill as much as possible. So you might think to yourself, so if my opponent has no cards in their drop, I can use this stride and automatically go +3 and +30k to the front. Sadly, that's not the case, because specifically this card states, and for each card that was not called from the cards you chose, then do this following part. It specifically forces you to at least choose the cards, and then your opponent shouldn't choose from the chosen cards you chose. That's a lot of choosing, but that's the way how this card rolls. So essentially what this card allows us to do is force your opponent to either discard 3 cards from their hand, or you give your opponent 3 new cards or bodies on the board, and you go +3, and you get +30k power to the front row. Now you might think to yourself, that isn't the ideal trade, and yes, that can be the case, but ideally you want to do that when your opponent already has a board set up. So they are forced to either choose to call cards from their drop on top of their units, so now those 3 bodies they get on the board actually can disrupt their field plan while also discarding cards from your hand, or they choose nothing and then you go +3 and the +10k power to the board. It's an interesting way that this card can interact with the amount of value it can generate. And it also has synergies with V support that specifically wants you to bounce cards to get value. And sometimes your opponent can play around this by not calling cards to the field. With this stride, you basically negate that counterplay, because now they are either forced to call units, thus playing into your plays, or to not call them and you go to plus multiple cards and get a bunch of power to the board. So, depending on the deck builds you do, and how your opponent is trying to play around this can be a very annoying stride to deal with, especially if you have the right setup. Now, is this going to be the go-to stride for every build? Probably not, because Nubatama has more options to their disposal, and this looks to be a very specific stride for very specific situations, because if you have the first stride and your opponent doesn't have enough cards in their drop, this might not be the ideal target, because you need to have at least 3 cards in the drop zone to get the full value of this card, which isn't ideal if your opponent just no guard at the early game and they have like only 1 or 2 cards in the drop. Now, even though their new stride is a bit questionable, their brand new G-guard for Nubatama is none of that, because their brand new G-guard is Rikudo Stealth Rogue Moray Lord, and Moray Lord has the effect, although when this unit is put into the Guardian Circle, costs Counter +1, and this unit gets shield +5k until the end of the battle for each card in your opponent's hand. If your opponent's hand has 4 or less cards, you draw a card. So essentially, this card can be a gigantic shield unit for the cost of a counterblast, or be a sizable shield like maybe 30k or 35k, and also draws a card which then basically refunds counterblast cost, because counterblast cost for a draw is decent, maybe a bit underwhelming in premium, but also don't forget you get the extra shield on top of that. So this fixes a bit of the issue with Nubatama, because if I remember correctly, most of the Nubatama cards require your opponent to have not a big hand size to get a certain amount of shield power, but they don't really do anything if your opponent has a gigantic shield, which is usually the case within premium. This isn't the ideal card to go into, because that means you basically get a free block for whatever attack they might dish at you. So a pretty nice G-guard that fleshes out the G-guard portion of the G-zone for Nubatama, and can potentially help the deck to at least survive certain playstyles and certain decks that they couldn't really do beforehand with the previous card pool they had access to. And with that said, that's also everything that I want to go over today. With today's reveals, it's very clear that Pale Moon is probably one of the better cards coming out of these new reveals, as their stride is relatively generic and pretty damn good in most situations, but their G-guard is taking the cake for what a G-guard is supposed to be. These are the type of effects we're looking for, and hopefully we're going to see more in the future as well, because that is what makes premium all the more spicy to play. And I cannot wait to try that new G-guard out as well. But with it said, that's everything I have to say about these cards. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below, and let me know which strides and which G-guards you're the most excited about. Of course, also keep an eye out for Unparkage when they drop these new cards, either with the pre-orders or when the set finally drops for English, to copy your copies as fast as possible. And don't forget to use the discount code PK Time Leap to get 5% discount on your entire order, to make everything a little bit more bearing for your wallet. But with that said, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/FranklinInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can go to patreon.com/FranklinInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!